If you've ever wanted to know how a Formula One engineer would analyze F1 data, well, here is my analysis for the 2023 Japanese Grand Prix Qualifying. I'll break down all of the performance trends and analyze the top teams and hopefully give you a better idea of what to look out for when you're watching qualifying next time. Also, if you enjoy this video and the detailed technical Formula One analysis, don't forget that I publish the entirety of this video in a report format as well as a detailed breakdown of every race over on buymeacoffee.com/break, or you can just click the link in the description below. So let's get into the qualifying data. So this is a great little summary. What this chart shows you is all the races so far and the fastest driver from each team for every qualifying session. And we can see here, Red Bull have been the benchmark for the entire season. Ferrari got them in Baku. Ferrari were very close in Austria, again in Italy, and Singapore. Red Bull was absolutely nowhere. And then again in Japan, look at the gap that Red Bull is put on everybody here. But something very interesting to note, and there's a couple of trends. So since Belgium, Mercedes weren't spectacular in Zandvoort, but they've definitely been getting closer to the front over the last 4 or 5 races. But McLaren also closing that gap up. And then if we focus in on Suzuka, look at the gap that Red Bull have put on everybody. You see everybody dropping back rearwards relative to the Red Bull's absolutely insane pace. And if you were to say, let's remove Red Bull from this weekend, everybody kind of looks like they're in their normal spots, really, in terms of pecking order. And I think we can kind of break that down in a minute and try to figure out what that's coming from as a guess. But after Singapore, Red Bull didn't even make Q3, and a lot of people are saying they've been nerfed by the technical directive, which was a clarification on floor stiffness, skid mounting, so the legality skid that controls how much they can ground or their ride height, and the front wing flexibility, which was technical directive 18. Let's quickly touch on technical directive 18, which there's been a lot of hype about that. Technical directive 18 is a attempt to limit teams from flexing their front wing elements relative to each other. There's a test which the FIA construct to test the deflection of the wings, but it's not really super strict about how they check flap compliance under load. So in short, my gut tells me, and after talking to a couple of people that know what they're talking about, is that what you would end up doing if you had a back off front wing is you would have a front wing that loses front load with speed. So relative to a stiff wing, in high speed, you would have more aerodynamic understeer at high speeds. So if that was the case, Singapore is mostly low speed corners, so you wouldn't really have that much of an impact. You might have a little bit of change in straight line braking stability from having forward aero balance by removing this, supposedly flexible front wing. I don't think that was anything to do with what Red Bull did. I know Christian said in the press, we didn't change anything on our car, but most teams would say that. But from objectively, if there was a huge change to Red Bull's car after the TD18 clarifications, I would 100% expect to see them hit by this technical directive in Suzuka. I don't think they've done that, considering Max especially set the pace. So I don't think Red Bull have been done over by the TD18. And if you look at the pecking order, if you remove Red Bull, I think Max has kind of outperformed the entire field here more so than anything else. And that's not biased. I'm just looking at the numbers. Remove Max from the equation, that's what you get. Not surprisingly, though, that Japan has some interesting circuit characteristics that are quite similar to Spa. For example, it's a circuit with a strong emphasis on efficiency, but also in order to go fast in several sectors of the circuit, you do have to have a reasonable amount of downforce on the car. So I think that's something very, very worth considering, and it's a characteristic that the Red Bull RB19 does extremely well. So let's look real quick, and this is just a quick representation of the qualifying pace from every session from Q1, Q2, and Q3. We can see that there's probably 90.5 to 89.5. There's probably about, from the end of Q1 to the end of Q3, there's about a second of track evolution. And because we had so many drivers, mixing, if they're running a used soft or a new soft, it was really a little bit of a difficult way to judge what the track evolution was without looking at that. So that's just something just to keep in mind when they're running and the run plans and everything else. And there's something else a little bit interesting about the run plans, which we can see here. Let's go to that. So if you notice, anything with a dash through it is a used set. Max ran one new set at the beginning of Q1, a scrubbed set in Q2, and then 2 new softs. Some people had to run 2 softs in Q1. You can see the large gap. So this is all the Q1 runs. This is when Sargent shunted, unfortunately. But if you noticed here, Ferrari were waiting so late in Q1 until after he shunted it out. And it's very interesting to see that Ferrari didn't set a banker early in the session and they just opted to go quite late. But again, also, you know, we've talked about this, especially in the wet and the dry as well, because you can have red flags and you can lose out. Ferrari also left it quite late. But here's the interesting thing about Q3. You've got kind of three options. You do what Max did and what Norris and Piastri did is you have enough pace so that you can save 2 brand new softs for Q3. So that lets you get the most learning on the track when it's at its best condition, because we have quite a bit of track ramp up through the session, at least 6/10 of track and 4/10 of driver learning through the session. Maybe if I had to guess what the split was. Max is able to run 2 new softs along with Norris and Piastri because they had enough pace in hand. But you have but here's the difference. You had Perez and Hamilton running a used soft to learn the track, learn the conditions. The wind did pick up from Q2 and Q3, and they used the track on a used soft to learn it, and then went out and did a new soft at the end. But Russell said, I only want to do 1 run on a new soft. I don't want to mess around with the used soft because I don't want to figure it out. And also that was from a timing point of view. Russell and Alonso did their run in the middle of the session, so they didn't get all of the track evolution, but they had a clean track to themselves to play with, whereas Leclerc and Sainz again left it very late in the session to get the most track improvement, and they only did 1 run. So they didn't do a banker and they didn't do a run on a used set to learn the track, which is interesting. It's super interesting. I think it's a little bit risky, and if we look at where they qualified, I don't know if it was a warranted risk or if it was a smart risk. I think it wasn't too bad and they didn't get bitten by it. So here's what the gaps in between all the teams look like in terms of pace. Now, keeping in mind teams knocked out in Q1 will not have the track evolution that guys have that make it to Q3. But if we look at this, we think there's about a second of track evolution. Magnussen would have still been a 29.6 had he made it in. So not a huge difference, but if there's about a second of track improvement, yeah, these guys that didn't get it together in Q1 could have knocked out some of the top dogs in Q2. And that's not exactly how that works, but I don't think it's too far from that. So Verstappen setting the benchmark, Piastri coming in second overall fastest team with the McLaren, 6/10 off, and this is 0.65%. That's a lot. That's a huge gap in terms of percentage off. And if we go back to the chart from earlier, in terms of gaps, that's midfield territory. McLaren in a field of their, Red Bull in a field of their own, or more specifically Max, and we'll clarify that in a second. The gaps, Piastri and Leclerc, very similar. McLaren and Ferrari, not too bad. Mercedes really struggling this weekend, and we're going to dig into the telemetry in a second and try to understand that. Tsunoda getting into Q3, Liam obviously just getting knocked out. Alonso on the struggle bus, and we'll have a look at their performance as well. And then Gasly, Albon, Magnussen, and just a quick segue. Did anybody see Alpine's tweet in response to Pierre Gasly's comment? He says, "There's something in my cockpit between my legs." And I know everybody's being really mature and thinking something. The Alpine admin got their hand slapped because they put out a tweet that said something like it was Pierre Gasly tripod, TM, trademark. They deleted that tweet shortly thereafter that. But that killed me. Oh my God, admin in trouble. And if we look at just drivers by themselves relative to each other, the McLaren's very close. Perez 0.7% off of Max. Sainz a little bit struggling relative to Leclerc. A decent gap between Hamilton and Russell, favoring Hamilton this weekend. Tsunoda Lawson. Lawson didn't get into Q3. There's a little bit of track improvement. I think he barely got knocked out in Q2. Not a bad performance. Stroll, obviously not great performance. Hulkenberg, Jerome, Sargent, obviously. But yeah, Albon. I was hoping Albon could get a little bit closer to the front this weekend because the car is quite slippery, and I think they could do some damage with a slippery car. But so be it. In terms of best sectors, there's not really a whole lot to take out of it. Max dominated everything. Leclerc, the Ferrari's weak in sector 1, which is the downforce sector. And Perez also very far off, and we'll come back to that, why Perez was so far off Max. Not necessarily why, but what it looks like. And if you guys are kind of like into this data stuff, do be sure to check out the link in the description below about Buy Me a Coffee. And this whole report in its entirety is over on that platform. So if you're not sure you want to join the membership, at least subscribe to the Buy Me a Coffee, because I send out free practice 2 qualifying, or every now and then a race report to everybody. And if there's any updates, it's a great way to keep in touch, and either that or join the Discord as well. But let's look at the telemetry. I think top speeds are another actually interesting. Before we get to the telemetry, I think top speeds are pretty interesting to look at. So we've got a compromise of top speed and lap time. So this is a really interesting chart that kind of tells you where teams are at in terms of downforce, drag, and overall performance of the car. So left to right on this chart is top speed. You can see that Stroll, Russell, and Hamilton among the lowest top speed, about 325. At the top of the charts, Verstappen 335. And then I've colored these charts by engine manufacturer because it's interesting. I think if I have them where I plot them by team color, but it's usually not that interesting. Obviously there's only 2 cars running the Renault engine, which is the Alpine, but you've got a good spread on the Mercedes, and you've noticed that Alonso, Piastri are up there, and Albon, as usual with the Williams, is very fast in a straight line. Relatively the downforce you can see from top to bottom. So Verstappen the fastest lap time, Zhou with the slowest lap time on the chart. Aston are missing a second driver. Yeah, I think I accidentally removed Stroll from this chart. Nope, he's here. Here's Stroll. He's over here. Almost caught me. But another thing to notice is, you know, in terms of the midfield runners, Mercedes okay in terms of performance, but they're definitely on the lowest end in terms of top speed, which could be a factor tomorrow, especially considering their pace is not so excellent. So we'll look into that. So let's quickly, let's just look at the map real quick and talk about speed and pace before we get into the telemetry, and help you guys get like a picture of the circuit in your head before we start looking at the telemetry. I think that makes it a lot easier. Right, I'm gonna go back to this one so you can see everything. So start finish straight. Here's turn 1, high speed, flat. Most teams at low fuel will be absolutely flat through turn 1 at low fuel, sorry, and then you'll break into turn 2, high speed rhythm section through the S's, getting close to going full throttle through 7. And then you have the 2 fast Degners, turn 8 and turn 9. These are right-handers. A lot of speed carried in through here, braking, slowing the car down into 9. And here's turn 11, the hairpin. You will see a lot of people not apexing turn 11. They're just rolling speed around the middle of the track at turn 11, and a few different drivers taking different lines. Earlier in the weekend, we saw drivers having some interesting over braking into turn 11 and losing traction out, and people are saying, oh, their engine's super weak, but that's not the case. It was literally just people, trying to carry a lot of speed on the way in and just carrying it a little bit too deep and killing their exit and delaying their full throttle point by 2-3 of a second, which makes them look slow on this long straight. You've got the spoon curves 13 and 14, very high speed, lots of combined into 13, and then having to brake and slow the car even down through 14. And this is a full throttle section all the way until you get to 16, 17, and 18. So let's talk about the sectors. Sector 1 is all about downforce. Yes, there's a long straight here, but if the people with more downforce are going faster through sector 1, because you will gain more lap time through the S's than you will lose on the straight from having too much drag. Middle sector is a good compromise. I think you need a lot of power, but you also need good downforce to make turns like 13 and 14 work, and also turn 8 and 9. You can lose a lot of time in turn 9, and also if you have a lot of stability and confidence in your car, you can make up a lot of time through turn 8, this super fast Degner one here. And then sector 3 is literally flat, 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 chicane, flat, flat, flat. So that kind of gives you a picture about what all these sectors are about. And there is only one DRS on the main straight this weekend. Yeah, I think they didn't want to have DRS going through the fast left-hander turn 15. So, right. Now, let's get into looking at Verstappen versus Piastri. And I'll walk you guys through the telemetry that I see. And I'll give a quick explainer on the first one and help you guys try to understand what I'm looking at. And then if you need to pause this or go back and rewatch it later, you can definitely do that. So let's talk about the telemetry. And we've got Verstappen versus Piastri. And I guess we'll have to go to this one and we'll zoom in a little bit. Yeah. I will zoom in as we go. So this is a normal telemetry compare that we have from Fast F1, which is an API that we have access to look at some simple telemetry data. So we've got car speed on the top, throttle position down here. We've got DRS on or off, and then the lap time delta. And you can see this chart, if the line goes above 0, Verstappen is ahead, and if it goes back down towards the bottom, that means Piastri is ahead or Piastri is gaining. So this bit, Max gaining, that little bit, Piastri gaining. The left hand is the start of the lap, and the right hand is the end of the lap. So this is like looking at left to right is going through the lap. And let's just I'll walk you through what I'm looking at. And immediately the first thing I'll always do is look at the straight line performance of these cars. And I would suggest Red Bull, more top speed when the DRS is on. We know the Red Bull have a relatively efficient DRS. They're running relatively high load throughout here. Now, if you notice here, you'd say, why is Max losing time on the straight? You can notice that he carries a lot more speed into 13, and he's a lot later going on full throttle here, so he does end up losing out to Piastri through the spoon curve. So now that you've got that and how to look at this, let's go look at the start of the lap. So start of the lap, Max carrying a lot of time down here, but only really gaining less than 1/10 of a second on the straight line down to turn 2. He carries a lot of speed. He has less clipping, so he's able to deploy battery almost all the way before he turns in for turn 2. You're flat through turn 1. Max carries just about 10 more kilometers an hour through turn 2. By the exit of turn 2, the full throttle point, Max is up 0.2 of a second. And then look at the difference in car speed through turn 3, 4, 5, 6. So what I will say is Max is a lot heavier on throttle, carrying 10 to 15 kilometers an hour through 3, nearly 20 kilometers an hour through 4, 5. And then what he does is he slows the car down at 6 in order to maximize going full throttle through 7. And at this point, Max is up about half a second on Piastri. So yes, he's slower here, but he's gained more time through there. There's not really much in between the compromise in turns 6, 7, honestly, because if you look at there to there, it's not much lap time. Then now remember back to the track map, turn 8, Degner 1, the fast right-hander, he lifts, Max barely lifts off for this, and he finds another 3/4 of a second almost into Degner 1 and carries a little bit more of that speed into Degner 2. The hairpin, again, Max, unless this is the telemetry slightly shifted because we've lost some samples early in the lap, it looks like Max does carry a lot of speed in and loses a little bit of time on the way out, but still he nets maybe 1/10 here. Now, Max does get a slightly worse run down to the spoon curves because of his full throttle point here. And then into the spoon curves, Max throws a lot of speed in to 13. He carries a lot of speed into 14, but loses a little bit on the exit of 14. He carries that time loss. You can see at the apex of this corner, he's 3/4 of a second up here. By the exit, he's only half a second up as he brakes for the chicane. So we go through 130R into the chicane. And then turns 16 and 17, Max gains a little bit of time on the brakes and finds maybe 1/10 here over Piastri. So the takeaways from that, I know I'll go through the next couple in a little bit less detail. Takeaways from that, Red Bull, good DRS, Max making some interesting compromises on corner exits, taking a big bite out of the entry and losing a little bit on the exits, but he had plenty in hand, so it didn't really have him over. I think if you saw that in the garage and you're like, you had another soft tire run, he would have given up a little bit of the entry of 13, 14 and a little bit of the entry on 11. And I think there's probably 1/10.5 left in that lap for him if I had to judge that. The car's performance and Max's performance through the S's in sector 1, phenomenal. Huge gains over literally everybody. We'll look through that more in a second. Max also really close to unmatched in turn 8, Degner 1. I mean, and let's go back and look at that real quick. This is, here's the S's, very fast through here. Degner 1, which is, you're going super fast, you're full throttle here, all the way through carrying that. Max just has a little blip, throws the car. There's a big compression. I think there's still quite a big bump on the apex of turn 8, unless they've sanded that out or ground that out. And then you got to slow the car, throw the car into turn 9 and slow it down. But you need so much commitment, because if you have an off track in between the Degners, you're not going to have a good day. You're not going to have a good day at all. So a lot of commitment. And I was talking to my old boss there, and he had a great point. Like, despite Suzuka being a traditional open circuit with gravel runoffs, it has a lot of the ballsy nature that you need to do faster on a street circuit as well. So super impressive. We've gone through exhaustively in the detail about Verstappen versus Piastri, and honestly, a spectacular lap by Oscar. I'm loving seeing the McLaren being a competitive car. I'm loving seeing Piastri getting his elbows out and fighting with Lando. We know Lando's a talent. I don't think there's any question that Piastri is also an exceptional talent, and the fact that they're getting so much performance out of that car and turning it around from mid-season, I love to see it. And I'm really looking forward to seeing Mercedes and Ferrari in that fight, and hopefully next season, and we have a glorious battle after Red Bull running away with it. So let's look at Leclerc's lap, and I think this will give us a little bit more context into just how well Max did in various places of the lap. So here is Leclerc's lap, and we'll dig into this a little bit. If you see this, but basically the Fast F1 is missing some data, and it gives me a little bit of a question mark. But I think looking at the sector times, this doesn't not make sense. I think Max is able to carry a lot of speed into turn 2. Leclerc's able to go full throttle a bit sooner, but by the exit of turn 2 in the full throttle point, Max is up 4/10 after effectively the first corner on the circuit. Again, nearly 20 kilometers an hour faster through 3-4 relative to Leclerc. And again, Max slows the car way down going into 6 in order to focus full throttle on 7. Basically by the time we get to the Degners, Verstappen's up 6/10. Again, Max carries 10 kilometers an hour faster through Degner 1. But look at this. This is an interesting. This corner, Degner 1, is about 260 to 270 kilometers an hour. 10 kilometers an hour through this corner only finds you less than a tenth. So a huge difference in a low speed, 10 kilometers an hour in a low speed corner, that finds you several tenths. High speed corner, you're not finding that much lap time through it, but those little bits count a lot, especially when people are closer than you than they are now. But Leclerc, a good turn 9, just not as much stability or confidence in the first Degner turn 8. Again, similar story. Verstappen deep into 11. Leclerc getting a slightly better drive. Leclerc finding nearly a tenth, I'd say, a tenth from turn 11, carrying that speed down into 13, 14. Max carrying a lot of speed into 13. Max carrying a lot of speed into 13. Again, I think Max, he's about the same overall lap time through this 13-14 segment as Leclerc, but I think Max had more, and I think Leclerc might have left a little bit on the table. And here's one thing that I want to talk about, and we'll come back to this when we get to Mercedes. Notice here, through the apex of this corner, here's spoon curve, fast left-hander rolling in. On average, we're about 250 kilometers an hour into this corner. Notice that the Ferrari has to hold a lot of throttle through these high-speed corners. You see it here. I wouldn't so much talk about turn 6 as, it's a very high-speed corner that you're trying to stabilize the car. Most people are on the throttle, but let's take both these, for example. Turn 6 and turn 13, 14, the Ferrari has to be quite heavily on the throttle in order to stabilize the car in a high-speed corner. So that's something we've seen last year, which has been a big trend for the Ferrari, and it's ever present in a track like this. So something worth thinking about is the fact that the only thing I would take away from that, and I could be wrong, but my takeaway from that would be that Ferrari have a lot of front end and high speed, and in order to stabilize the car, you have to apply a little bit of throttle to stabilize the car by killing some of the rotation. That being said, I really feel like that kind of tendency is rarely a good thing for being good on the tires. If you notice the Red Bull was off throttle rolling, you'll have a little bit of engine braking to help rotate the car, but it should be quite a stable car. So Ferrari needs to be applying torque to the rear axle in order to stabilize the car, which is just putting more energy into the rear tires. I think it's a little bit more tricky there. And like as Andreas has mentioned, can you mess around with a throttle in the differential linking? Yes, you can, but I feel like they can't run any engine braking in high speed. They have to run some positive torque on the rear drive in order to stabilize the car, rather than running engine braking. It'll just be too unstable if they run full liftoff. Which brings me very nicely to Lewis Hamilton's lap in the Mercedes. Lewis Hamilton's lap of 129.9 to Verstappen's 28.8, a second off and a bit. Now let's dig into this. I mean, I don't think this is going to be Mercedes' finest circuit, and it certainly hasn't. Taking a step all the way back, Verstappen with an easy 10 kilometers an hour DRS on, DRS off, pretty similar. Maybe a little bit less scrub through turn 15 for Red Bull here. Looking at the start of the lap, Verstappen is half a second up at the finish of the S's. Again, Max really good pace and performance through turn 2, and again very strong through turn S's basically. But notice this as well. Also, Lewis does the exact same thing that Max does, where he prepares turn 6 and focuses on driving, getting a good drive out of 7, and I think that's a pretty good way to do this. But Lewis not lacking the full stability, Lewis having to back out of the throttle a bit. And notice this. The first thing I notice is through these super high speed corners that are on the lower end of the speed range, Lewis also has to hold quite a bit of throttle on the car, which is super interesting. And it tells me, and then I don't need that to tell me, Lewis's interview after qualifying saying, you know, in earlier in the weekend in practice, the car was struggling a little bit with setup. Then they got it in a window, but the biggest problem was that he has the car has a lot of front end. They don't have the rear end to deal with that. So it's like, okay, the car looks to be very pointy, and I haven't picked up on too many of those conversation points so far this season. And then I went back through the season and looked at all of their qualifyings back to Silverstone, and I noticed that they're not Ferrari level of having to hold part throttle in corner, but it's definitely more apparent than Red Bull and some other teams. So it really starts to make me think, there was rumors that Aston Martin were hit with this technical directive 18 to deal with front wing back off as early as Baku in Canada. Is there something in there that's also hit Mercedes as well? So rather than speculate on that, I'm going to do a little bit of a video or analysis. Maybe it'll be just a short looking at Mercedes characteristics in terms of their high speed perceived balance that I can see from how much throttle they have to hold, to see if there could be some legs in that, because there's a couple of other speculations that it could be, but I'm not really clear. I'm not really clear on that is. So let's go back to the rest of Lewis's lap and look at it. So to be fair, Lewis a pretty strong sector 2, Max gaining a lot of time here in 13, again then matching between Max and Lewis through 14, and then the chicane, Max carries a lot more speed in than Lewis, but Lewis gets a better drive out of it, and you can tell that the DRS points are synced up. So I think that's a pretty clear trend that Lewis has a better focus on the exit of the second half of the chicane. So I think that's fair to say. This is not Mercedes track. If Mercedes, I mean, let's break it down. Mercedes lost a quarter of a second DRS speed, and they lost basically the rest of their lap time in high speed. The low speed, reasonable. Lower medium speed corners, also reasonable, but the high speed performance, not great, which is typically downforce and stability and balance, and straight line speed. So I think that's a good summary of where they're at. I'm not going to go into detail about this because we've been going on for nearly 45 minutes, but Verstappen, just Tsunoda, very similar, just no high speed performance, losing out a little bit in straight line. Alonso the same. Alonso really struggling with some of the medium speed stuff as well. Nothing great. Now I'm going to pull up this lap, and I'm not going to tell you who it is, but we're just going to talk about it. We'll talk about Blue Cars Max. You'll be able to see what it is, but it's super interesting to see. Max puts the same amount, I'll just say it. Max puts the same amount of time into Perez as he does most people in other cars. He also has that much more commitment through turn 8. And then the rest of the lap, they're very similar. And I think there's a bit of a data glitch here on the entry, but the lap time delta stacks up at the end 3/4 of a second. Max gains, a quarter of a second in the final chicane. So I think Perez maybe not ideal on the brakes and straight line and not getting a good drive out of it. But for everything we know, they're driving the same car, and there's no reason to believe that they're running drastically different cars that are to the tune of 3/4 of a second. And it's to the point is, I'm not trying to ride Max, but he put this amount of lap time here through the S's in turn 2 into most drivers, even in cars with the McLaren that have a lot of performance. I just feel like Max is super in tune with this car, and he's able to put the car completely on the limit and use up so much of its performance. But Max with a absolutely phenomenal qualifying performance. Now, another interesting thing before we get on to the little Q&A session at the end, and I'll try not to keep you guys for too much longer. I hope you guys are enjoying this, and if you haven't clicked the like button yet, I'd really appreciate it, because it helps me out a lot. I do appreciate it. And yeah, let's look at Piastri versus Norris, because they had a little bit of a flippy floppy. which is interesting. So Piastri in blue, Norris in red. If the line goes towards the top, Piastri's faster, and if the line goes towards the bottom, that's where Norris is faster. So Piastri made a comment, something to the effect of, on his final lap, he's like, yeah, I screwed up all the easy bits and nailed all the hard bits on his lap. So Piastri loses out quite a bit of time through turn 2, and it looks like that sets him off on his rhythm through the rest of sector 1. He also struggles turn 7 a little bit, and then from sector 2 onwards, the Degners, Piastri's okay on the high speed bit, struggled a little bit, lost, you know, a tenth here, and at turn 9. Turn 11, no real difference between the two, and he's actually gaining on the exit. It looks like Piastri just gets on. Piastri rolls a little bit more speed through the apex at turn 11, despite getting on throttle later, and he carries that and maybe finds a little bit of a toe down to 13. Turn 13, 14, Piastri just a little bit sooner on throttle out of 14, and he finds easily a tenth down to that. It looks like Piastri's also scrubbing a little bit less speed through turn 15, so maybe Piastri have a little bit of a dummy line through there. I'm not sure. And then Piastri gets a really good chicane and finds another tenth or so there. So realistically, if you, let's say that you put the best part of Norris's lap and the best part of Piastri's lap together, they would have been 2 tenths up. And if we go back to the performance gap between everybody, let's put them 2 tenths up. A 28.9 to a 29.4, there'd still be a 29.2. So they're not, even with the best between the two of them, they're not matching Verstappen and the Red Bull, which is quite interesting. So the only other thing I think that I've got before we get to the little Q&A is, first of all, if you enjoy this kind of analysis, definitely check out the Buy Me a Coffee, and actually this qualifying analysis in its entirety is available. So if you enjoyed reading through this and you want to like read through it and study it some more for yourself, check out buymeacoffee.com/break. Go over to posts and you'll see this qualifying analysis. And if you really enjoy it and you want to see every qualifying and every race every weekend, definitely consider joining the membership over there for the price of a coffee a month. I post these in their entirety, and the reason I do these is because this is how I enjoy Formula One, and this is how I analyze and understand stuff, because I like understanding the tech side of it. So I do these reports for myself every weekend, and then I was like, why do I just keep these for myself? I don't put all this information in a video every weekend. So I was like, why don't I do this? I'll spend a little bit more time, polish it up, wrap it, package it into a report, and share it with you guys. So I hope that you guys find value in that, and I hope you find that it improves your enjoyment and understanding of the sport. And if you have questions, please always leave me a comment in the reports on the Buy Me a Coffee site, or join the Discord, the community Discord, and we talk about it in there as well. So